Now that the weather is getting colder and conditions are legitimately getting worse, fantasy football start-sit decisions become insanely tougher than they ever were before, and it's crucial to get into the playoffs or secure that playoff seed you want. Lucky for you, this is the only start-sit video you're going to need. I go over every single matchup this week with sportsbook odds for game and player projections to give us an analytical edge, every single wide receiver matchup based on what corner they're lined up against, how positive or negative that is, weather reports, there is a lot of snow and bad ones this week, and so much more. And since everybody loves this series so much, I decided to make one just for the running backs, going over every single matchup with offensive line and defensive line rankings, defensive scheme and zone blitz rates, and so much more that other creators just don't do on YouTube. So if you appreciate the research that goes into these videos and don't want to miss that one coming soon, drop a like and make sure you're subscribed to join us as fantasy football champions, getting this video every single week. Starting with the Dallas Cowboys and the Detroit Lions, you see first we have the sportsbook odds, then we'll get into the weather notes that we have written right under that, and then you can see the Cowboys here. This is where we have the fantasy points allowed to that position. So for example, the Lions are allowing the 4th most fantasy points to Dak Prescott and the 32nd most, which is the number 1 least amount of fantasy points to running backs. So we'll get through all of that with every single matchup. The Dallas Cowboys here, you want to pick and choose and take every single spot you can from this matchup because it has one of the highest projected game totals at 53.5 points, as you can see here, and it is projected to be a very close game. The Lions are only -3. This is one of those spots where we can go through, look at a Dak Prescott, a CeeDee Lamb, a Pickens. These guys are guys we want to start. Obviously, we know the Lions matchup is allowing a lot of fantasy points to them, and you can see the defensive back matchup here with Rock Ya-Sin and also DJ Reed. The green is indicating they are very, very positive. As you can see, the red for the fantasy points are indicating that it's not. And then we see here that the Lions defense is actually better versus the slot wide receivers. Luckily for us, the slot wide receiver for the Cowboys is Kevontae Turpin, so no one's really going to be starting him anyways, and they're extremely positive everywhere else. We can see here that Jake Ferguson, the tight end for the Cowboys, does have a very negative matchup as far as fantasy points allowed from this defense. You can start him in this matchup simply because of the amount of pass volume that is expected from the Cowboys and also the game total, but I'm not really loving it. He seems to be more of a touchdown or bust kind of guy this week. You can see the weather here. I almost forgot. Thursday, indoor game, no weather concerns there, but I will tell you, later down the line of this list in these matchups, there are some huge weather concerns you want to stick around for. The line side of things, you can see the Cowboys defense is extremely positive and allowing fantasy points to literally every single position. The Cowboys, as you can see in the notes at the bottom, they can stop the slot a little bit. In Cowboys terms, you can't stop the slot. They just are a little better versus that. But they allow the number 1 most fantasy points per game to left wide receivers playing on that side of the field. And guess who that is? The wide receiver that is putting up more points than CeeDee Lamb, it is George Pickens. He is a must start. He will go nuclear in this week's matchup. We also do like all of these guys, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jared Goff. I would start David Montgomery, but I'd be a little bit restrictive. The sportsbooks do have him for a good amount of carries compared to Jahmyr Gibbs, a lot closer to a 50-50 split than last week, so he can be started. We do have Amon-Ra St. Brown likely missing this week's matchup, so it makes Jameson Williams a top 5 wide receiver for me this week. You can go through and start Tesla or Khalif Raymond if he's healthy, but unless you're in a super deep league, I really would not consider it. Again, with Brock Wright as well, he's getting a decent amount of target share. He can be put in a spot if you absolutely need it, but the Lions are a very top-heavy offense. They don't really give the ball out to other guys as far as a steady target share. We look at the next matchup of the week. We have the Tennessee Titans versus the Cleveland Browns. Very, very low game total, guys. This is Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. I'm excited and really excited to watch this game. But you see the game total, 33.5, the number 1 lowest of the week. You do not want to be starting anybody in this matchup. I'll keep it quick and I'll keep it short. 3-mile-an-hour winds, not too much of a deal there. But 41% chance of rain and possible snow because it will be 32 degrees in the Browns' home stadium. You don't want to go with anybody here. I mean, Cam Ward, you can see how good, generally, this Browns defense is in stopping every single position in fantasy points, except for the tight end. But Chigakonkwo is splitting snaps with Gunnar Helm, and he's outproducing him in fantasy football. So literally everybody on this Titans side is a sit. You can see the Browns here. The Titans are a little bit more positive in allowing fantasy points to the run game. They're very positive there. Judkins can be a start. Everybody else in this matchup I do not love. You can see the Titans defense here are a little bit better versus stopping slot wide receivers, even though Amore Davis is a more positive corner matchup for Cedric Tillman, but we don't even need to go into the corner matchups for these guys because you don't want to be taking pieces here. I would start Harold Fannin over David Njoku if you need a tight end there, but him and Judkins are really it for this matchup. Then we go ahead and look at the Seahawks and the Falcons, getting a little bit higher in that game total here, 43.5 points, but still on the lower side. 7.5 point favorites are the Seattle Seahawks. You can expect not a lot of scoring from the Falcons here. It's an indoor stadium. The Falcons are home, so no weather concerns in this one. But you see Sam Darnold coming into this week questionable. He's fully expected to play. Just know he picked up a little bit of a questionable tag coming into the week. But the Falcons defense, very, very positive to allowing points to running backs. We see Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet are both getting top 10 matchups in that aspect. They do split pretty much everything, though. Kenneth Walker has been getting a majority of the goal line snaps, which is a positive for him. I would be starting him over Zach Charbonnet again, considering how much the Seahawks are supposed to win by. You can expect they're going to lean on the run a little bit more, but really what I want to talk about here is JSN. We know AJ Terrell has the name value of a really good corner, but he hasn't really been playing up to it recently. And as far as a total defense for this Falcons team, they are one of the most positive in allowing fantasy points to wide receivers on the left side. That is JSN. They have been getting worse by the week. If he doesn't put up 20 fantasy points this week, I would genuinely be surprised. Rashid Shaheed gets a negative matchup against Mike Hughes. He hasn't really been doing anything so far this year, so I wouldn't put him in your starting lineup. I'd rather start Cooper Kupp. D. Alfred is a more positive corner and scoring fantasy points on, but he's out of the slot. It is going to be a little bit risky because Sam Darnold just doesn't have the highest pass volume. He'll complete 15 passes and get almost 300 yards off of it, but Cooper Kupp's not the type of guy that would benefit from that. And AJ Barner has been a decent option for some people in deeper leagues at the tight end, but you can see the Falcons are allowing the second least amount of fantasy points to the position, so we're not putting him in our starting lineups. You can see on the Falcons side of things, this defense for the Seahawks is amazing everywhere. You can see the notes here at the bottom. They're terrible versus slot wide receivers, though. It's the one thing the Seahawks can't really stop, that and the tight ends. I would be starting Kyle Pitts in this matchup, again, considering that it is a top 10 matchup in fantasy points allowed. I wouldn't start Sills. I know he's actually been kind of decent over the past few weeks. Devin Witherspoon is technically the slot corner there, but even if it is technically a positive matchup, if Drake London does play, you're never putting him in your starting lineup. Darnell Mooney against Josh Jobe is a pretty negative one. He will move to Tariq Woolen if London doesn't play, but these guys are just way too risky. Outside of Bijan Robinson, who does get a negative matchup, I don't really love anybody with him and Pitts, of course, the only two. Then we go down to the Colts and the Jaguars matchup. One of the higher projected game totals, getting back up to that number we love to see, 47.5 points. And this game is projected to be very close. The Colts are minus 1.5 point favorites. But again, you look here at the weather, 5-mile-an-hour winds, not anything crazy. Don't need to worry about that for as far as our matchups and wide receivers and passing volume. 40% chance of rain, though, 64 degrees. The Jaguars are home. We will see as the days get closer if the rain is really going to affect this matchup. I don't think it'll be anything crazy, not one where I'm having to sit the wide receivers because of it. You look at the Colts, pretty much everybody gets a positive matchup. Greg Newsome, Altanic Brown, they're both positive corners and allowing fantasy points to wide receivers. But what you can see and really how you exploit this Jaguars defense is that they are really bad against outside wide receivers specifically and better versus the slot. So this is a game where we can expect Alec Pierce to maybe not absolutely go off, but I wouldn't be surprised if he catches a 50-yard touchdown this game and does his thing. I'm starting Alec Pierce. I wouldn't necessarily sit Pittman, but I would definitely have my reservations with him. Josh Downs does get the most negative cornerback matchup against Jordan Lewis. He hasn't really been getting a steady target share to be in our starting lineup, though. But the good news is that Tyler Warren finally gets a good matchup. He's had one of the toughest schedules over the past month and a half. Now he gets one, allowing the second most fantasy points. We're starting him. We're starting Daniel Jones. Even though Jonathan Taylor gets a really negative matchup, this Jaguars team, we'll get into the running backs later. Guys, I am dropping an entire video of running back matchups grades with offensive line rankings, all that stuff. So make sure to stick around for that coming in the later days. He's still a start, though. Kind of a sneak peek to that. We look at the Jaguars. The Colts defense are good at stopping the run. Trevor Lawrence, I actually do like in this week's matchup, even if they aren't allowing a lot of fantasy points there. Travis Etienne, despite the split between him and Tuden looking really bad over the past few weeks, it really is not as drastic as you'd think. It was a blowout last week, so Tuden got a lot more work. Travis Etienne is still by far in hand of this RB1 role. I would be starting him. Also, we do see Brian Thomas back in this matchup against Blackman, Jacoby Myers against Travarius Ward. I actually do kind of like Jacoby Myers in this week's matchup. I definitely would be starting him. Brian Thomas is more of a hit or miss at this point. You see it's a top 10 matchup in fantasy points allowed. It's also a very good matchup for Brenton Strange. So for whatever reason, if he or Trevor Lawrence is still on your waiver wire, definitely go through and pick them up. I wouldn't be going through and getting Parker Washington in our lineup, especially if we have Brian Thomas Jr. back and all of these tight ends and wide receivers too. Kenny Moore is a decent corner and allowing fantasy points though, but we can see Sauce Gardner is going to be out for the Colts this week, allowing a lot more points to the left wide receivers, and that is Brian Thomas Jr. So maybe he'll have somewhat of a get right game, but at this point, can we really expect it? He is a risky start if you put him in there. Next up, we have the Washington Commanders and the Minnesota Vikings. Back down to one of the lower point totals. This is a game where you don't want to be picking and choosing everybody to put in your starting lineup. Again, this game is projected to be close, though. We will have JJ McCarthy back in this matchup. I'll get to that later. The Vikings are home in their home stadium, which is positive for them. And the kickers, I would be starting Will Reichert in this one. But you look at the Commanders side of things, the Vikings defense is pretty good on paper, but they're actually allowing a decent amount of fantasy points over the last few months of the season. Marcus Mariota, all the wide receivers, you can see it's bottom 5 matchups and fantasy points allowed to the position. I guess you could start Chris Rodriguez. I would not love it. He's going to be touchdown or bust. Zach Ertz 100% can be started with the target share that he's getting, but we do have Terry McLaurin back in this matchup, and he gets put on Isaiah Rodgers. And Isaiah Rodgers has actually been one of the most positive in allowing fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Terry McLaurin, I would put in our starting lineup. They are a little bit better versus the right side of the field, and that's just so happens to be where Terry lines up at. So he definitely will be risky. I do like starting Deebo Samuel a lot more against Byron Murphy in this matchup. We can see that the Vikings defense just generally allows a lot more fantasy points to the slot. So those underneath routes of him and Zach Ertz are going to be a lot more beneficial than the outside of Terry McLaurin. Probably going to need a couple deep passes to be viable. And you look at the Vikings side of things, I mean, the Commanders offense is allowing a billion fantasy points to literally every position. It's not very often. Almost every position is top 5 in fantasy points. You see here what I want to point out with the wide receiver matchups. Justin Jefferson has been one of the most disappointing wide receivers so far this year. I don't think he's put up over 15 fantasy points since his bye week in week 6. Absolutely atrocious. We do get JJ McCarthy back in this matchup, which at this point is better than Max Brosmer. But what's really more important is that he gets matched up against Mike Sanders still. And Sanders still has been the most positive out of all corners in the NFL in fantasy points allowed on a per route run basis. They do target him a lot, so he does get a lot of breakups. And technically, like NFL terms, he's not that bad, but fantasy points allowed, he is the worst. So Justin Jefferson can be put in our starting lineups this week. You just got to hope that this 1 week benching for JJ McCarthy is getting him right and he'll be back in the lineups and actually be a good quarterback. We do have Aaron Jones, though, questionable, probably doubtful coming into this matchup, which makes Jordan Mason the RB1. I would definitely be starting him if that is the case. Again, we see the Commanders are top 3 in fantasy points allowed to the position. Jordan Addison does get a positive matchup against Jonathan Jones as well, but again, considering the low game total, I would be a little bit restrictive putting him and TJ Hawkinson in our lineups. We can see the Commanders defense are actually getting better now that Dan Quinn has been calling the plays. So I wouldn't necessarily be trusting them in our starting lineup because we don't know what to expect from JJ McCarthy. And we look at this matchup here against the Bengals and the Bills. This one has a little bit of weather concerns. We'll get there in a second, but you see the game total, 51.5 points. One of the highest of the week. We want to be taking our spots here. The Bills are projected to win this game by 5.5. A little bit higher than I would expect, but the Bills are a lot better defensively than the Bengals. We all know that. 4-mile-an-hour winds. Again, the wind isn't anything to be scared of here. It's more of the snow. 39% chance of snow. The Bills are home, 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Absolutely terrible. For those of you in Celsius, just mean that's cold. There is a chance of snow that would hinder the pass game a lot. We will see. It is only a 39% chance, so maybe flurries, if anything. It's not going to be a ton where you have to worry about the pass game. But Joe Burrow here gets a negative matchup technically against the Bills defense. They are allowing some of the least amount of fantasy points, so I wouldn't throw him into our starting lineups. I know if you just got him back last week, you probably needed him, but if you have other options, I would probably go with them. Not waiver wire level, like I would not be starting Marcus Mariota over him, but let me know in the comments what start sit questions you guys have. I'll help you out there. Chase Brown does get a very positive matchup though. As of the last month, the Bills have been really positive to fantasy points and yards allowed to running backs. Again, I will go over that deeply more in our running back breakdown video. If you take out last week against the Steelers, they are really positive. So Chase Brown's definitely a start here. We do have Samaje Perine working into a lot more work than we expected. I wouldn't start him in this matchup though. He's more of a check down, play from behind kind of guy, which maybe this game script does work for him. But we look at Chase Brown against Christian Benford. He is a positive-ish matchup. We can see the Bills defense are very weak versus the left wide receiver specifically outside of everybody else on the defense. So Jamar Chase is going to eat, especially if we don't have T. Higgins probably out another week with his injury. Tre'Davious White is a more positive corner than Benford is, but Andre Yoshivas would move into that wide receiver 2 role if he were to miss. Not necessarily a guy we need to start, but definitely a valid flex option. And then we're not starting any of these Bengals tight ends. We know that Joe Burrow actually targets them a decent amount, especially when there's no T. Higgins. There is actual data that shows that Joe Burrow targets tight ends an insane amount when Higgins is not in these games. But we can see that the Bills are allowing the number 1 least amount of fantasy points to tight ends. They held Dalton Schultz to like 1 catch. They held Kincaid to 2. If you just look at the game logs for the entire season, they are really, really good, even against good tight ends. You look at the Bills side of things here, we can see Josh Allen gets a very positive matchup. Everywhere against the Bengals are really good, but you see the wide receivers. They actually have been pretty decent in stopping fantasy points to the wide receivers. Daxton Hill has been the more positive corner to take advantage of on the defense. But you see here, the Bengals are a little bit better versus those right wide receivers. even though Daxton Hill himself is a more positive cornerback matchup, the guys that line up on the right, that's not positive. The way that they run their defense and the two high safety looks that they use, I wouldn't start Keon Coleman. Not that anybody would anyways. I do actually like Khalil Shakir in this matchup. Again, if we go back up to the game total, it is projected to be decently high. So this is one where we can take our spots with him. Kincaid is questionable coming into this matchup. If he does play, I'd start him. The Bengals are allowing the #1 most points to tight ends. If he doesn't play, I don't want to start Dawson Knox. He's splitting snaps with Hayes a lot, so I would not love it there. But again, this defense is weak everywhere else. We're starting Khalil Shakir. Then we go down to the Saints and the Buccaneers matchup. Another low-scoring game, 42.5 points, which is why these matchup grades are so important for these videos, because you wouldn't know this stuff otherwise. You see here the Buccaneers are projected to win this game by over a touchdown. It should be a very, very good matchup for them. 6-mile-an-hour winds, a little bit higher than typical, but nothing that we need to worry about. 44% chance of rain, though. Again, this is another Florida game. Bucks are home, 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Not too much to worry about there. Again, possible chance of rain, but nothing that's supposed to be super, super serious. You can see Tyler Shuck, more the positive matchup. They allow a lot of points to quarterbacks because you got to keep up with the Buccaneers. You have to pass a lot, and their secondary is kind of worse compared to their run defense. But you can see here, Alvin Kamara is questionable coming into this matchup. It is a spot where we can start Devin Neal, but nothing more than a flex. If he's not going to receive passes, which he hasn't been doing, it's not going to be that safe of a play. We do see Chris Olave here gets a more positive matchup against Jacob Parrish compared to Devon Vele against Zion McCollum. But the Buccaneers defense really can't stop anything over the top. That's how you beat them. So this is a really good spot for Chris Olave in a catch-up game script where they should be passing a lot. Vele is a risky start. He has been getting a decent amount of target share, but nothing that I want to throw in our starting lineups just out of nowhere. The Buccaneers here, we see the Saints defense is actually pretty decent in stopping fantasy points to pretty much everybody. But the wide receivers here technically get negative matchups and fantasy points allowed, but the cornerbacks themselves in a fantasy point per drop back and per route is actually pretty positive. The reason this is a bit of a difference is because the Saints get blown out a lot, so teams run on them all the time and they don't have to worry about the pass game. So that's why just looking at fantasy points allowed isn't always going to tell you the full story. We see Quincy Riley, Kool-Aid McKinstry, all these guys, Alontae Taylor, are all positive in fantasy points allowed, but they are extremely good, I guess positive, I would say, in left wide receivers. So that is Quincy Riley. That is Emeka Egbuka. He will be started this week, but there is going to be a lot more target competition now that we have Chris Godwin healthy. We have Tez Johnson in there, and Mike Evans is going to make his return pretty soon, but you can start him and Cade Otton in this matchup for now. We look at the Steelers and the Ravens matchup here, 43.5 point total. This is a week of low game point totals. We see the Ravens are projected to win this game by about a touchdown, which is surprising right now, at least. 2-mile-an-hour winds, not a concern. 8% chance of rain, 42 degrees. Ravens are home. No weather concerns in this one. We look at the Steelers side of things, though. Aaron Rodgers, pretty much everything is projected to be positive. I would not put Aaron Rodgers in our starting lineup, though. I don't think we need to talk too much about that. Jaylen Warren, I would definitely put in there. We know the Ravens are very positive, and they allow a lot of fantasy points and yards per route run before contact, which is a positive thing. The Steelers' offensive line is another situation, but this isn't a spot where I would be going through and starting these fringe guys. So Calvin Austin, you can see, even though he gets a really, really positive matchup against Marlon Humphrey, I would not be starting him. Kenneth Gainwell, only if you're in a PPR league and just need to rely on his receptions, because he's essentially their wide receiver 2 right now. But with the low game point total, it's not one where you want to be taking a shot on these guys. And you can see the Ravens are very, very good against tight ends. And it doesn't help that the Steelers run a 3 tight end system with Darnell Washington, with Jonnu Smith, with everybody else they want to put out there. So we're not starting any of those guys. And the Ravens defense is actually improving a lot. Over the last month, they've been getting better. So they're not necessarily as positive as they look on the game script here. The Ravens side of things, though, this is one we can't start Lamar Jackson. I know he's been pretty worrisome. He hasn't been running the way he has, scoring the touchdowns. This should be a divisional matchup where he can do that. Derrick Henry does get a very negative matchup. If there's one thing the Steelers can do consistently, it is stop the run. But Derrick Henry is Derrick Henry. He's going to do his thing. If the Ravens are going to win this game by a touchdown like they say they are, this should be one where Derrick Henry falls in there and is a start for us. Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman. The Pittsburgh Steelers have actually been allowing a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers, even though we see Joey Porter Jr. and James Pierre here are more negative matchups specifically, but you beat them over the top. This is how you beat the Steelers. They are pretty good in the middle underneath, but Zay Flowers, the over routes, I wouldn't be throwing Rashad Bateman into our starting lineup. I think Zay Flowers can do a little bit better than he did last week, but we know he's always going to be a risk. Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews are both getting positive matchups. I do see a trend here of Isaiah Likely being more and more used as the season goes on, but with them splitting, you're going to rely on a touchdown or bust. I probably would start Mark Andrews in this matchup over Isaiah Likely. We go ahead and look at the Dolphins and Jets matchup though. One of the lowest, right next to the Browns and the Tennessee Titans at 40.5, and it is projected to be close at 2.5 point spread for the Dolphins. 3-mile-an-hour winds, 7% chance of rain. The Jets are home up in New York. Nothing to worry about here with the weather. It's going to be a little bit cold, but they play football for millions of dollars. They can survive that. We look at Tua. Positive-ish matchup for him. You're not starting him. Devon Achane, though, probably the best situation, does get the most positive matchup. The 4th most fantasy points are allowed to running backs. He's in our starting lineup. You look at the wide receivers in Jalen Waddle and Washington here. Brandon Stevens, you look at Jarvis Brownlee, they're both kind of positive, but ever since they lost Sauce Gardner, they really have been so bad. So the Jets defense, very positive versus the wide receivers that line up on the left side compared to everywhere else in the slot and the right. So Jalen Waddle is going to be a start here in this matchup, even if it is a very low game point total. But again, you don't want to be taking these guys that are fringe flex in these low game point totals. You see the Jets here. We see Tyrod Taylor gets a really good matchup, not starting him. Breece Hall, you can start. I really would not like any of these wide receivers here. You see Jack Jones, Rasul Douglas, they're pretty positive. I would not really take the risk of starting any of these wide receivers or Mason Taylor in this one. You look at the Broncos and the Raiders in this matchup, though. A surprising low total of 40.5 points, only because the Broncos defense is so good, and they're also projected to score more than 7.5 points than the Raiders. It's an indoor stadium though. The Raiders are home, so nothing to worry about with the weather. Everything to worry about with the matchups. We'll get into the Raiders in a second. Bo Nix can be started. It is a little bit more risky because of how low the game point total is. If RJ Harvey falls in the end zone for a touchdown, there is a chance Bo Nix doesn't do anything. But you look at the matchups here for the wide receivers, Blue Kelly and Eric Stokes, very positive corners and allowing fantasy points to wide receivers on a per route run basis, almost top 10 in that. We see Courtland Sutton and Troy Franklin both positive in this one. I wouldn't start Troy Franklin again, considering how low this game point total is. The Raiders defense has actually been pretty good versus the slot, so that's Pat Bryant. I do like stashing him though. If he's on your waiver wire, I would pick him up, but I would not start him this week. But on the other side of that, they are really, really bad versus left wide receiver specifically, and that is Courtland Sutton. So we can put him in our starting lineup. Hopefully he's not touchdown or bust. Evan Ingram, I know he had a good game last week, looked pretty efficient, but very negative matchup against the Raiders. I wouldn't trust it to happen again. And then we look at the Raiders side of things. You see how negative this Broncos defense is allowing fantasy points in literally everything, bottom 5 and almost all of it. Pat Surtain has returned, very negative matchup for Trey Tucker. We look even everywhere else, like Quincy Riley, McMillan, all these corners are very good, even the slot corner. And that's even worse for him because they are really, really good in stopping the slot as everywhere else too. So we're starting Ashton Genty, be a little bit restrictive. Really nobody else though in this matchup outside of Brock Bowers, of course, who does get the most positive situation out of all of those guys on offense. We look here at the Rams and the Cardinals, a bit of a higher game point total, getting back here at 48.5 points. The Rams are projected to win this game by a ton, over a touchdown. This is a good thing for Jacoby Brissett though in this offense, which we will get into in a second. No weather concerns. Cardinals are home. Indoor stadium, great for us. We look at the Rams. Matthew Stafford technically gets the most negative matchup in fantasy points allowed compared to all these guys, but you are not sitting Matthew Stafford, who is in the front running, I guess, behind now Drake May for MVP. He passes a ton. Touchdowns are a ton as well. They don't actually run the ball in the red zone a lot, which again, I will get into in the running back video coming later. But we see with Kyron Williams, very positive matchup for him. I'm not really high on him this week though, even considering the matchup, but I do think he is a start. We look at Puka Nacua. I mean, are you ever sitting Puka Nacua? Are you ever sitting Devontae Adams? I think he's more likely to score a touchdown than not. Forget the wide receiver to cornerback matchups. The Cardinals are good versus the slot and nothing else. Tutu Atwell. Nobody's going to be starting Tutu Atwell anyways, so that doesn't matter for us. You're starting all of your main guys here. I would not start the tight ends for the Rams. They use too many of them at once. The Cardinals here with Jacoby Brissett. Negative matchup technically. This defense is very good in stopping quarterbacks, but also running backs. The run game is really good. We see Trey Benson questionable for coming back into this matchup. I don't think he will. If he does, it's definitely going to be in a limited capacity. Bam Knight will operate as the RB1 if DeMarcado is out again. So many question marks at this position, and none of them are really that good. They're touchdown or bust. It is a high point game total, so I would start whoever the RB1 ends up being. But again, you're taking a big risk with that. Marvin Harrison is also doubtful coming into this week's matchup again with his heel injury. Very, very high chance he doesn't play, which makes Michael Wilson an amazing start again. He was the most targeted wide receiver in the NFL when Marvin Harrison Jr. was out. So Forbes is going to be on Harrison, but if he's out, that moves up to Michael Wilson. Still a relatively positive matchup here. Greg Dortch also moves up the rankings if Marvin Harrison Jr. is out because he plays out of the slot and gets a lot of those dump off passes. The Rams are really good versus wide receivers that line up on the right, which is Marvin Harrison Jr., which will be Michael Wilson if he does end up missing. I'm still starting him in the matchup though, but there's still positive for everybody else. And Trey McBride is obviously going to be started as the tight end 1 on the year. You look at the Bears and the Packers matchup, 44.5 point game total, about average, about in the middle. The Packers are projected to win this game by almost a touchdown, which seems a little bit high if I'm being completely honest. You look at the weather here, 7-mile-an-hour winds, nothing really crazy, 5% chance of snow because it's going to be so cold. We don't have to worry about the snow. That's a very, very negligible amount. What's more worrisome here is the weather with 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That is freezing. Again, for my friends in Celsius, just know you would never go outside in that. The Packers are home, of course, where else? It's not necessarily going to hurt the pass game a ton. Again, if there's no snow or rain or anything, it doesn't really matter. I mean, again, they're NFL players. They have recovery stuff. They have the big jackets. They'll be fine. But we see here with the wide receivers and the quarterbacks, not necessarily positive. The Packers defense is very, very good. And you can see this note down here. They have been very strong over the last month and a half of football. I would be starting some of these running backs. It's tough to say which one though, because DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monunga are splitting almost 50-50 in red zone work too. You're going to be hoping for a touchdown. This game point total isn't insanely high, but it's good enough to start DeAndre Swift. Kyle Monunga I would treat as a flex player, but you see all these wide receivers, Nixon, Valentine, Bullard, they're all really good corners. It's not insanely positive, and we never know who's actually going to score the most points. So I would start Rome Odunze, leave everybody else on the bench for the wide receivers there, but it's really tough to expect, especially in this technically cold weather and the low-ish game point total. I wouldn't want to run my risks there, but we look at the Packers side of things, a lot of notes on this one. Jordan Love gets the most positive matchup. The Bears are allowing a ton of yards and points. Josh Jacobs, technically a negative one. We're still starting him here. All of these wide receivers, though, is really what we need to look at because you see Tyreek Stevenson, Jalen Johnson is back in this matchup getting on Romeo Doubs. You can see they're allowing the number one most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers that line up on the right. That is going to be Romeo Doubs. But now that Jalen Johnson is back in this matchup, that kind of goes to nothing. You can't look at season stats when one of your best corner on defense is coming back. So that's something I don't want to deal with. I'm really not starting any of these guys because we do have the possibility of Jaden Reed coming back in this matchup. I don't think he will play, but if he does, it just adds to the complexity of these wide receivers. The Bears defense is strong against left wide receivers as well. Very, very good with Christian Watson. So I would not be trusting him or any of these guys or any of the tight ends. It's really Jordan Love and Josh Jacobs unless you want to take that risk. But we look at the Texans and the Chiefs matchup here. Very, very low game point total at 41.5. Close game as well at 3.5 for the Chiefs. This is not one where we want to be taking these fringe flex guys because it's going to be a slow defensive centric game. Both of these defenses are really good. 6-mile-an-hour winds for the weather, 4% chance of rain, nothing to worry about here. It's going to be cold, but so what? The Chiefs are home. And you look at the Houston Texans side of things, it is going to be a decently negative matchup. We know how bad these defenses are in allowing fantasy points. I guess technically good. But you look at Trent McDuffie, the most negative corner on Nico Collins. The Chiefs defense is good. Slightly weaker versus wide receivers on the right, which is going to be Jaden Higgins, but I don't want to trust it. Jaden Higgins is lower down the start sit list. He can be in there for you if you need it. Woody Marks, Nick Chubb, both negative matchups. I really wouldn't want to start anybody here if I had the opportunity to. Maybe Dalton Schultz, though, if anything. You look at the Chiefs side of things, all red. The Texans defense, the only note I have here from research is that the defense is amazing because it is. They're bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed to pretty much every single position. You can start Mahomes still just because there's not that many great quarterbacks. Isaiah Pacheco, Kareem Hunt, I would not love to start them, especially with Pacheco maybe healthy this week. You see Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy, they're not questionable. This was from last week. They're going to play. Rashee Rice is technically questionable, but Petrie, Lassiter, Stingley, all good corners. You're starting Rashee Rice. That's about it for the rest of these guys. You look down to the next matchup here with the Eagles and the Chargers, the last one of the entire of week 14 before our fantasy playoffs hit in week 15. It is an indoor stadium. Chargers are home. SoFi, amazing. The game point total, again, another really low one at 40.5 points. The Eagles are projected to win this game by a field goal. There are a few key points, which is making these point total so low for this matchup specifically, which I will get into. But the first one is going to be this Chargers defense, which is actually pretty good. You can see they are very good against the pass all the way through the slot, the right and the left, and the wide receivers. And everywhere, even deep. Jalen Hurts is going to be a start this week because of the rushing upside. Saquon Barkley has been so disappointing, but technically gets the more positive matchup against this Chargers defensive line. But the wide receivers here, very tough. Dante Jackson is a more positive corner in allowing fantasy points. AJ Brown can be started. I would not trust anybody else. Goddard is going to be a touchdown or bust kind of guy. You look at the Chargers here with Justin Herbert, technically a positive matchup-ish for him and the wide receivers. Really, really good for the running backs, though. We do have Omarion Hampton likely coming back in this one. It will depend what kind of reports we see. I'm not going to tell you to throw him in your starting lineup just yet. Monitor those reports, see if he's fully good to go. He's probably going to be on some sort of snap count. If you're in the fantasy playoffs, you probably have been sitting him this entire time because he's injured and are still there, so you probably don't need him. If you need him, you can start him. Kamani Vidal is also the RB2 there if he doesn't, for whatever reason, end up playing. The wide receivers, though, is really what's more concerning because every single week we have to decide which one of these Chargers wide receivers will go off. You can see here the Eagles defense is strong everywhere except the right side of the field specifically. So that is going to be Keenan Allen. That technically gets the best matchup. Quinyon Mitchell is technically the most positive corner as well. You do see Quentin Johnson against Adoree Jackson and Cooper DeJean on Ladd McConkey in their slot, the slot corner there. Ladd McConkey technically gets the most negative matchup. We know that Quentin Johnson is really touchdown or bust. One game he'll give you 0, one game he'll give you 10. I don't love starting any of these guys, but you have to go with some of them. I would start Keenan Allen just at a very, very risky play, and that's really the only one that I'm kind of trusting. Around a Gatson, I would sit as well because the Eagles defense is very good in stopping tight ends. But that's going to finish out this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one, which is going to be the running back breakdowns of every single offensive line, defensive line, all the statistics nobody tells you. So make sure to stick around, have your post notifications on for that, and I will see you there. All glory to the man above.